Hi, and welcome to the Working Differently in Extension podcast. I'm Bob Birch. Great to have you along today for the podcast. We've been having some wonderful conversations the last couple of weeks based on articles in the Journal of Extension. You can find those at joe.org. This is another one. We're going to be talking with Carol Smathers, field specialist from Ohio State University Extension. Welcome, Carol.
Hi, thanks for having us.
And Jenny Lobb, a research associate at Ohio State University Extension. Welcome, Jenny, to the podcast.
Thank you.
And we're talking about an article from the Journal of Extension called Extension Professionals and Community Coalitions, Professional Development Opportunities Related to Leadership and Policy, System, and Environment Change. It's a long title, but I think it's a great article. And I want to thank you for submitting it and for talking to us about it today. The article is really based on survey results that you guys got around this idea of extension professionals and community coalitions. Carol, why did you guys decide to do the survey in the first place?
Right. Well, we were aware that so many extension professionals are currently working with coalitions, but just didn't know the extent. So we really did the survey to be able to quantify the participation with coalitions and describe it in more detail. And then beyond that, we wanted to look at the nature of their work and what professional development opportunities might be associated with that.
When we talk about community coalitions, is there a way to sort of define that a little bit more? I mean, a lot of extension professionals work with people in their community. How do you know if you're working with a coalition?
Sure. Generally, we think of coalitions as groups of individuals and organizations across sectors who are working towards a common goal. And things that you usually see with coalitions is that they're pooling resources, they're sharing resources, they're reaching more people, more individuals, more groups than any of them could individually, and they're usually deriving a mutual benefit from being part of the coalition.
So, Jenny, can we talk a little bit about the methodology of how you approach this? So who did you actually survey, and what were you trying to get at with the survey questions?
Sure. So this was a survey of extension professionals at our institution, so Ohio State University Extension, and it was across all 4 of our program areas. And it was an online survey, so we sent a link to the survey using listservs for each program area, and the assistant directors sent an email ahead of time just to let people know that the survey was coming and endorse that, so we would have a little bit more buy-in. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Well, let's talk about the questions a little bit, because you guys were looking for, areas where you might need more professional development. But I mean, thinking of it from a blank sheet kind of perspective, I mean, there's so many questions you could have asked about work with coalitions. What was your process for figuring out what exactly you wanted to get to?
Sure. Well, we knew we wanted to ask the basics. Are you involved in a coalition? What type of coalition? Who are the members? But then how are you, and how is Extension especially involved, and how does Extension support the work of the coalition? And then Jenny and I both come from a public health background, and there's a real emphasis in public health in focusing on what's called policy, system, and environment change strategies. We refer to them as PSEC, P-S-E-C. And that's recognition that individuals' behaviors are shaped both by their knowledge and attitudes about things they learn through education, but also factors on greater levels of influence around them. So things in their social environment, or organizational practices and procedures, and then policy and systems practices throughout the community. And coalitions are often best poised to make a real difference in those larger spheres of influence.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the policy system and environment change strategies. One of the things, and we had a recent conversation back in the late fall with some folks in the University of Minnesota Extension who are working with networks around food systems. One of the things that was brought up in that conversation was just sort of either Extension's lack of comfort or concern with working on, as soon as you say policy, like, if we're involved in policy, are we in some way seen as lobbying? Can you talk a little bit about, is that a concern that has come up at Ohio State? And well, we could go on a conversation of how we deal with that, but I'm just curious, has that concern come up in your organization?
Yeah, so in the public health world, there are really two types of policy. There's the big P policy, which is what people tend to think about, government and laws and that sort of thing. But there's also little p policy, which is within organizations. And so when we're talking about policy in this context, it's often working within an organization to get things in writing that this is the way we operate. So it's a little bit less scary than the big P policy. Yeah. An example is that at Ohio State Extension, we have healthy eating at meeting guidelines. So that's a organizational policy based on the literature, where there are many extension professionals who are promoting healthy eating through their programming efforts statewide. And so as an organization, we have these policies or guidelines, I should say, that are a loose policy to help people working for extension serve nutritious foods and model what they're teaching out in the community.
But that said, it still remains very important that we don't shy completely away from the big P policy work. The whole premise of PSEC strategies is that the farther out you get, the bigger ring, the more you can make changes in policies and systems, the greater number of people that you'll reach, the greater population impact you'll have. So when we think about impacting legislation around health issues, there's a lot of ways that Extension can support that work without lobbying. And it's the lobbying that people are concerned about. And lobbying, of course, is promoting a specific piece of legislation to a policymaker and making a specific ask about that policy. If you're not doing, just one of those three, you're not technically lobbying. And there's a lot of education that can be done just providing the research background on topics without talking specifically to how you want a decision maker to vote on a policy.
Yeah, I think that's an critical point, because I guess from my view, we might have trouble addressing some of these big issues, whatever they might be, childhood obesity or just health in general, if we don't address that part of it. Is working with community coalitions or networks sort of, one potential strategy, so that maybe there's somebody else in the coalition who can do the things we can't do?
That's exactly it. I was at a coalition meeting the other day, the Ohio Adolescent Health Partnership, and they said that very thing, that here's some upcoming legislation. We know many of you in the room, have some restrictions through the agencies that you work for, but there's nonprofits in the room that are going to carry this forward for us.
So let's talk a little bit more about the methodology. One of the things that you guys point out in your article is that you did have sort of some, I don't want to call them inconsistencies, but some anomalies in response rate from different groups, and that might influence sort of how you could generalize these results. Jenny, can you talk about exactly what the issues were with the response rate and maybe why that affected how you could view the results?
Yeah, so I think that some of the program areas may be just by nature more conducive to working within coalitions than other. For example, almost everyone who works in the community development area responded to our survey. And of those respondents, most of them were involved in coalitions. And so it just seems like a very natural fit in that line of work to be out networking and partnering with others who are going after the same goals to be able to achieve what you're setting out to achieve.
So you got a much higher response rate from that group then, just in general, on the
Yes.
survey? Okay, and so that may have skewed the results in some way in terms of what professional development needs are, or not. Carol, you seem like you disagree with that.
Yeah.
For those who are listening to the audio, we are doing this over video, so I can see some body language here, and I sense some disagreement.
No, I'm just not sure about that. It's just what Jenny was saying, that some of the program areas are more conducive to work with coalitions, and yet I think the professional development needs will be similar to understanding coalition development, coalition functioning, and then the concept of policy system and environment change.
Yeah, it seems though that I don't say though because I'm not necessarily disagreeing here. I just do our community vitality people, community development people already have some of this background when we're hiring them, as opposed to somebody who maybe is working in ag or horticulture, or maybe even in the food and health area. I don't know if there's a question there.
I think you've raised a great question for us to explore further.
Okay, there. Good answer. So let's move on to the results a little bit and sort of what you found about the whole thing. So what kind of coalition projects are extension professionals in Ohio working on?
There's quite a range. We have a lot of health related work. Infant mortality is a big topic in Ohio right now. There's food policy councils. There's housing and hunger and other issues related to poverty, chronic disease prevention, obesity prevention. And then we have things like soil and water conservation groups. So quite a nice mix of projects going on.
When you look at the primary focus of the coalitions overall, 2/3 were to provide services and resources to the community. And really just over 1/3 were health promotion focus. So really varied.
And what kind of roles are extension professionals playing in those coalitions? I mean, I assume it's varied, but was there sort of, a lot of, people responding that they play a particular role, or?
Yeah, close to 40% play some sort of leadership role, either as the coalition co-chair, so the actual the chair or the co-chair of the coalition, or a member of the coalition steering committee.
I wonder if a lot of extension professionals, will be. I wonder. Well, I don't know what I wonder. I guess I wonder lots of things, but I have trouble expressing them sometimes. I wonder if extension professionals, should be looking into their communities to try and build these relationships, or if extension is responsible for some of the coalition existence. Was there any kind of response to that? I mean, leadership could be, did the coalition already exist and you came and were like, hey, you get paid by somebody, we're going to put you in charge and none of the rest of us do, or is extension really starting those activities? Did you get a sense for that at all?
That's a good question. That's not something we explored, but very interesting.
And as I remember, we asked how long the coalition had been in existence, and we found quite a range. It seemed to be a lot of variation between less than a year to 5-10 years in existence. I think that's an important question about the role of extension in these coalitions. we have the content, we have a lot of content knowledge. We've got the educational resources of the land-grant university. Usually the extension professionals out in counties have well-established relationships with organizations and groups across sectors. So they just play a great role. They have a lot to offer on these coalitions.
Well, one of the things you did ask is for those people who were not involved in coalitions, why? What were some of the responses that you got back of why an extension professional wasn't involved in a community coalition?
Well, I think the most common response, which was heartening, was that others from Extension were already involved, and so people just didn't see a need to have multiple people working within the same group, as long as there was representation there. Another common response was I was brand new to my position, and so those individuals just hadn't had the time to build those relationships and find out what sort of work was going on in their county to get involved. And so building on that, we talked a little bit in our discussion about how maybe this is a point to bring up when people are onboarded, that, kind of plant that seed to think about getting involved in a coalition if there's not representation from the community already there.
So let's move on to the professional development needs a little bit. What were respondents saying in terms of where they feel their skills might be lacking or where they could learn more?
There. Turning to my notes here a second.
That's okay. I'm shuffling paper too, so.
Yeah, they thought that they could most benefit from some training on maintaining and sustaining coalitions, just basic coalition function. An interesting area that they highlighted was that they'd like information on coaching coalitions for success. And Jenny and I have been working on a project the last few years that looked at the use of a community coach to help coalitions function better, to sort of give them feedback and encouragement that let them find the answers to their community's challenges. Coalition development, fundraising, grant writing, and obtaining tax exempt status. So that's an important one for some independent groups.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting that, people are asking for help and how do you sustain these things, at a local level. Maybe sometimes an extension professional sort of is that consistent person where people might come and go and organizations might change, and we've been here for 100 years so far. Maybe continue moving on in that direction, and that seems to be a place where maybe extension professionals are not super prepared, right? That where they might be prepared in their subject matter and their content area, but not in that kind of role.
Right.
One of the things you mentioned in your article was this idea of community coalition action theory and maybe building some of the professional development around there. Carol, can you talk a little bit more about what is that theory and why did you think it was important in maybe forming a professional development plan?
So community coalition action theory is one of the most comprehensive theories related to coalition work. It was developed by Fran Butterfoss and Kegler in 2002. And it's really a roadmap for building and maintaining and evaluating the work that coalitions do. It gives us a framework. She talks about, or they talk about the stages of coalition development. So if we can help extension professionals help their coalitions identify what stage they're at, then their work can become more targeted, more effective. Talks about defining the community context, what's going on, in the social political environment. That can make a lot of difference in whether the coalition's work is going to be is going to be accepted by the community that they're working in. The lead agency, the convener group, plays an important role in the theory, and that's kind of what you were just talking about. Is extension often the convener group? Are they the central organization? And what then does that mean about their role? So we like to use that as a framework.
And I think we mentioned this a little bit earlier too, but another thing that you pointed out was that extension professionals should have a basic understanding of this idea of policy, system, and environment change. How do we sort of communicate that, or how do you think maybe why is that a new concept to extension professionals? And
I can speak at least to extension professionals involved in health-related topics. Traditionally, health education or health promotion has been very heavily leaning towards education. And so, we have lots of professionals who have been health educators for years and years, and now funders are starting to talk about public health and community level type health interventions, and it's a big shift. And so I think there's a steep learning curve for many, and there are mandates. For example, the USDA has mandated that the SNAP educators be involved in this type of work, and so it's a steep learning curve that's happening quickly, and thus there's a need for professional development around that.
One of the things that at least there's some concern over, I've heard some of it, is how extension exists in sort of this environment of networks and coalitions. Because I guess the argument is, how do we show value to our stakeholders if we can't point to extension did A and the result was B, and instead extension contributed to this greater, longer term effort? How do you guys think extension can go about sort of not only evaluating, I guess, but also showing impact working within these kinds of coalitions, especially addressing, big challenges that, it may be many years before we can say we reduced, infant mortality by this much, or we reduced, to actually get to the big change.
That's exactly it. That's a lot of the challenges around doing policy, system, and environment work. People are hesitant to take it on because it take years to accomplish. The milestones are very incremental. They're not always linear. Sometimes you make progress, then somebody new comes into power in the community leadership, and the efforts take a step back, and then they move forward again. But it really is just what you were saying about taking part of the credit for the outcome. And I think that there's a growing acceptance for that as funders and other organizations better understand the nature of policy work, that it does require this cross-sector collaboration, and we each get a piece of that credit pie. But we've got to look at evaluation in new ways to do PSEC work. Another thing is to actually ask the coalition, survey them on how they've benefited from having extension be a part of their work. I think Wisconsin did a survey like that a few years ago, where they surveyed a network of coalitions about the value of having extension professionals either lead or contribute to their work, and got some real interesting data on their actual impact.
What do you recommend? What you learned based on what you learned from the survey and your knowledge of extension and coalition work. What do you recommend for organizations who are looking to have more of this happen maybe within their state? Are there certain professional development opportunities or certain ways they should be approaching that? No, nobody wants to take it.
Well, as I think extension is becoming a resource in this area, for one, as Jenny mentioned, with the new mandates around SNAP Ed using multiple levels of multiple strategies at multiple levels in the communities. They're getting very well educated about policy, system, and environment change strategies, and I've seen some great trainings available across the country, Washington State University, other land-grant universities. Also, their State Department of Public Health and their local health departments. As we said, I think the concept of policy, system, environment change and the health impact pyramid originated at the Centers for Disease Control, really originated in public health. So they've got some great resources and training materials for those of us who want to get some more skills in that area.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think it's it's a fascinating reading. I hope folks go out and find the article. It's called Extension Professionals and Community Coalitions, Professional Development Opportunities Related to Leadership and Policy, System, and Environment Change. You can find it in the Journal of Extension, JOE.org. Carol Smathers, Jenny Lobb, thanks so much for joining us today on the Working Differently in Extension podcast.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Working Differently in Extension. I'm your host, Bob Birch. Great to have you along as always. Just a couple of quick reminders. Hit us up on Twitter. Stay informed about upcoming podcasts and future guests. The Twitter handle is @WDNEXT. You can find us on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/Working Differently, and a new home for show notes starting this week. It's bobbirch.com. That's BOBBERTSCH.com. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to talk to you soon here on the Working Differently in Extension podcast.